As you can tell in this particular lesson, we've got readings from African American writers and a middle class white female writer from roughly the late 19th century, as you would expect, with realism and naturalism being the movement of the era. Uh, you say, well, what in the world do these things have in common? Well, when you think about it, a lot of the works of realist writers, be they W.E.B. Du Bois, some people pronounce it Du Bois, you can pronounce it either way you want, Booker T. Washington, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, all of these guys have something in common. Yes, their works exhibit the same sorts of traits. They're trying to describe the world as they see it, not as it ought to be sometimes, but as they see it, no matter how gritty that depiction may be, no matter how, sometimes not so happy those circumstances may be. But there's another thing, as I hinted in our last lesson, that these writers are very interested in, and that is depicting social problems, depicting them in a way that confronts us with those social problems. Oftentimes that's what good journalism does. It makes us look at the reality of what's going on in our world and then leaves it up to us as to what to do about that, if anything. Taking Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois together as a pair, you don't have to, but they're often read as a pair for a very good reason. Number one, they were contemporaries. Number two, they wrote in response to each other. Number three, they were both African American males. And number four, they are writing about the plight of African Americans post-slavery and the very, very important question of where do African Americans go from here at that time, right? Where do they go now that the war has been won and emancipation has been written into the law, right? How do we achieve the equality that the law now promises? Because the world they lived in, of course, post-Civil War Reconstruction, was anything but a sort of democratic paradise for Black Americans, as you can imagine. One of the things that's kind of interesting to do, and you can do this beginning with these two writers if you want to, is to take a look at African American writers, and of course these guys are writing nonfiction prose, okay, but it doesn't. And they're public speakers, very prominent individuals, highly educated individuals. They were the kinds of guys who, when they gave speeches, their speeches were on the front page of the newspapers in most major cities. They were turned to as great thinkers and spokespersons for African Americans, but their very disagreement on a number of issues underscores the fact that the notion that African Americans and the debate over civil rights was some sort of monolithic voice is very wrong. It's very much a myth. There has always been disagreement among African American writers and among writers of various colors and backgrounds and ethnicities as to how to achieve civil rights, how to ensure civil rights, what the best path is forward. And these two guys are exhibiting that. You can see that in the lecture notes. I mean, you've got Washington, who believes that the key to political power and social equality is an economic power, and that economic power will only be gained once blacks begin at the beginning, and that is train themselves as vital tradespeople who are able to provide the skills necessary to run a major world economy. That has a lot going for it as an argument. Du Bois, on the other hand, looks at it and says, no, if you do that, that is absolutely the wrong path. We will always be relegated to underclass, second-class, working-class citizens that way. We have to create our own intellectuals. We have to have our own sort of intellectual revolution. We have to have our own accomplishments in the arts and in philosophy and in science and these kinds of things. We can't just be sort of blue-collar people who are hardworking, salt-of-the-earth people. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not enough, according to Du Bois. The various other arguments that Washington makes, and of course, you read the material and you looked at the notes that I wrote. Both of these guys are struggling with this sort of social and political paradox of African Americans. What do I mean by paradox? Well, the paradox is this: the law now said that there is no such thing as slavery. But then the law also says separate but equal, right? We start getting that with Plessy versus Ferguson, but essentially the Jim Crow era means absolute segregation. And so the law says no slavery, but the law doesn't say equality. And that's a paradox. How do you deal with that? How do you reconcile those two? Then, of course, the social paradox, which is you have an increasing and growing black American intelligentsia. There are African Americans who are making inroads in the sciences and the arts and in politics and economics and all these areas, but their upward mobility is completely limited because not just because of politics, but because of social norms. That very segregation limits them. It's not just about, you can't just use the same bathrooms or sit in the same part of the bus. It's the fact that, no matter how bright a young man or a young woman was, if he's African American, he's socially only going to go so far. The limitations that are there, when the promise of American equality is that no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, you have the same potential to rise to whatever your abilities can take you. So the issue over education is a very important issue because which route do I take as a young person? The route that Washington is advocating, or do I make a complete break, as Du Bois is arguing? As I said in the notes, it's hard not to sympathize with Du Bois because when we look back and especially at Washington's arguments, he has an awful lot more faith, I think, in the innate goodness of Southern post-Civil War whites than I think I would be willing to give them. That without Yankee interference, whites would embrace equality with blacks down south. I'm not so sure I buy that. It's not an awful lot of historical track record to support that it was all brought about because Northern intervention was what caused Southern whites to react so vigorously with respect to Jim Crow laws. And not sure I buy that. And there's something to be said for Du Bois' argument that, look, you need to highly trained people. You need intellectuals, because without that you don't have the intellectual and philosophical leadership. What's not so appealing about Du Bois is the fact that he's highly radical, and he is really doing something that or advocating, at least in some passages, things that make some of us a little bit more uncomfortable, which almost argues for a sort of black separatism at points. Dabbles with Marxism, for example. Not things that a lot of people say are, red, white, and blue, all-American kind of stuff. In a strange sort of way, you would see a kind of repeat of this, in fact, later in the 20th century, wouldn't you? Between the kind of approach that maybe a Malcolm X would say ought to be embraced versus that of Martin Luther King. I'm not making the analogy between these two pairs of men any further than that they show diversity of opinion. I'm not saying that Martin Luther King and Booker T. Washington had that much in common. I don't know that they did. But the fact that you had two very strong voices, very divergent voices, really important. Du Bois, in the final analysis, to me anyway, this is a commentary, so you're getting a little bit of my thought, I think simply strikes us as being much more modern in his language, in his intellect, in his philosophical approach, and even in his use of metaphor. That vast veil metaphor is a deeply, deeply profound point. You remember when he was a child, he goes on about the veil that exists between them. And that's a metaphor that's not a very easy metaphor to wrap your head around, but it truly, when you think about it and you figure out what he's talking about, it truly does depict the separation between himself and his white, and that at that time classmates, and then later in life adult peers. There's always that barrier, he says. It's always there, and sometimes you as a person of color may not even be aware of it. You kind of go on and live your life, he says, but it's always there, and every now and then you're reminded of the difference. That there. In this way, he really presages modernism in many ways. He sees the racial issue as far more complex. He's much less optimistic, I think, in the final analysis if you press him on it, and sees it as part of the larger, difficult, some might even say unsolvable social problems that modern industrial America would be facing in the next century. So I don't want to sell Washington short. I really don't. I think he was a brilliant man, but it's Du Bois that really speaks to us, I think, as being much more modern.